Thank you, Alan, and good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be here and good to see a good turnout. I was reflecting as I was chatting with a couple of people at lunchtime that I've been in this emergency management sector for many, many years, and if we'd held a forum like this 15 years ago, you probably would have had John Hanmer in his office and 2 or 3 others of us sitting around his desk, and how things have changed, and I think for the better. So good to have you all here. You're probably wondering to yourself, what has the Red Cross got to offer in terms of the research perspective? And I'll try and share that with you over the next 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have some questions. I'm also mindful that it's post-lunch and you've all had a good feed, and we need to keep this fairly light and lively, otherwise it could get very slow. Let me start though by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting today. I'm sure that was done a little bit more formally first thing this morning. Unfortunately, I didn't make the morning sessions. But I'd like to also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And also a bit of a nod to the crew from Fire to Flourish, who were a big part of a gathering up in Lismore last week that focused on First Nations communities and some of the impacts of some of the events up there in recent times and ways to move forward positively. I look forward to catching up with some of the team and hearing a little bit more about that in days to come, but I'm sure it was a really great event, and that's the feedback I've had. So, where does Red Cross fit into this? Well, I would share with you that about a month ago, it was late August, I think from memory, mid to late August, we celebrated the 110th anniversary of Australian Red Cross, or Red Cross in Australia. So Australian Red Cross turned 110. And for those who know me well, I wasn't around at the beginning, but probably not that long after. What I'd like to do this afternoon is share with you just a few observations around who we are and what we do, just as a bit of a scene setter really, and to give you a bit of context. I then want to focus in on what research means to us and how we utilise research, and a couple of examples of specific things that we've done in terms of research informing both our policy work and our practice work. And then lastly, really start to put things back to all of you and look at some of what we consider to be the future challenges that we're going to be dealing with as an organisation that focuses a lot of time and energy on disasters and communities. And then start to leave you with a few questions around how does research fit into this, and how can research contribute to what I think is the critical thing for all of us, and that's the well-being of the people that we all work with or have some connection with. So first up to the Red Cross and our 110 years. Interesting timing in that I did a presentation along these lines at the AFAC conference a couple of weeks ago. And I actually subtitled it From Spanish Flu to COVID, because it's not quite exact, but fundamentally the Red Cross existence in Australia ties in with those two things. And I think that's significant, A, because of the length of time, obviously, but just as significantly, I think the two major events that bookend our time in Australia are actually not what would typically be referred to as natural disasters. I don't want to get into debates around how we define natural disasters or don't. But one of the things I will talk about a little further into the discussion is that I think some of the funding arrangements around what we all do have really defined us into it's a bushfire, it's a flood, it's a cyclone, when in reality, if you're living in the community, it might be an act of terrorism that causes you grief. It might be the impacts of COVID, and we all experience them in some way, shape or form over the last few years. Likewise, people who lost loved ones in Bourke Street when the tragic situation happened down there a few years back. From a Red Cross point of view, from a humanitarian organisation point of view, we tend to focus on the consequence of these things. And to that end, I just wanted to flag the significance of those two events, both the Spanish flu, early days of Red Cross, and of course the COVID response more recently. In between times though, it's fair to say that natural disasters have had a massive effect on us as an organisation, but also on the communities in which we all live. And I've listed just a few there on the slide, a few of the major events that have happened in the last 40, 50 years, going back to Cyclone Tracy, Ash Wednesday, tsunami, Bali bombings, very different events. Bali bombing had a huge impact, not just on those people in Bali, but also on members of the Australian community who had loved ones either deceased or injured as a result. And of course, Black Saturday more recently, and a range of other different events that have taken place in the last few years. And I think the significant thing here is that these events are happening obviously more and more, and I'll touch on climate change and a couple of other drivers a little bit later. No surprise that from a Red Cross perspective, the humanitarian guy who speaks in the afternoon wants to focus on people. That's who we are and that's what we're on about. And I wanted to really highlight a couple of things. If you have a look at those couple of images on the screen there, does anyone know the gentleman in the yellow high-vis top in the picture there? I ask that because he's Victorian and you never know. I have had an audience where someone knew him. No? He's a gentleman who lost his house in the Black Saturday fires in and around King Lake. That's him standing out front of the house that he used to live in a day or two afterwards when our volunteers came to visit, essentially. What I'd ask you to do is just to reflect for 30 seconds or so on, if that were you, what do you think would be most important to you? What do you think you'd be dealing with over the next couple of years, 2 to 5 years in particular? Just give that a little bit of thought for a moment and I'll shut up for a second. The media would focus on, his name's Peter. The media would focus on Peter for a day or two. There would be a lot of attention to the devastation around him. There'd be a lot of graphic footage. Social media may pick up on a couple of issues. Was he well enough supported by government? Did organisations running public appeals give him the money he needed, etc., etc.? There would be a range of things going on for probably a week or two. The reality for Peter, and I would ask you to think about this in terms of the reflections you just made. His house is in ruins, that's obvious. What's not so obvious from one picture is that his street's been destroyed as well. He's a professional musician and he used to basically just play in pubs and cafes and things around the local community. They're all gone, so he's lost his livelihood. I'm not sure whether or not he has children, but if he does, or if he did, he'd have to relocate them to another school because the school's gone. He may have lost loved ones. At a minimum, he's lost neighbours and local connections in the community. His level of insurance, I'm not sure what it was, but no doubt he will be negotiating, discussing with insurance companies for the next little while how to make things right and what he did or didn't have covered. The cost of the rebuild is likely prohibitive in the first instance, but it's also likely to be in an environment where rules are changed and suddenly you're dealing with bushfire ratings and the like that weren't there when you insured before the thing happened. So there's a massive impact there as well. Finding builders. Not as big an issue back in 2009, but certainly still an issue. And think about it in today's terms, the cost of building, the actual challenge of finding a builder to do the work for you is enormous. He's also had an extremely traumatic experience on the day and he's got to make the decision around whether or not he wants to live there in the future. It's been his home, it's been the place his kids may have grown up, but does he want to stay there given what they've been through on the day or days after? He's also living in a community that's been incredibly badly disrupted. King Lake was really knocked about by Black Saturday and had challenges in terms of reforming and getting on with things afterwards. Contrasted with places like Strathewen, which is just down the road, down in the valley below where King Lake sits up on a hill, who actually seem to manage a little better. So he's got that working with him as well. What I guess I'm trying to say in short is that recovery is a really long and exhausting process and the impact of these events on people is enormous. Moving is considered to be one of the 4 or 5 most stressful things you can do. That's when you do it by choice. when it's thrust upon you like this, it's a whole other can of worms. There's probably a lot of people out here who have done a renovation at some stage or built a house or done some of those sorts of things, if you're lucky enough to be in that circumstance. There's a lot of challenges come with that when you do it by choice, but when you're not doing it by choice, when it's just from one day to the next, suddenly you're into it, the challenges can be enormous. And that, I think, is really significant from a Red Cross point of view, but I would suggest should also be the driver of everything that all of us in this emergency management sector, and I loosely include the research component within that, that should be what we're focused on, improving the lives and well-being of people such as that. Let me press on. As a result of increasing disasters, climate change and other things driving them, we're seeing more and more intensity and frequency of disasters and things that will cause harm to more people. So from a Red Cross point of view, strategically, we aim at two things: to enable and strengthen the capacity of people and communities to participate, so in other words, to lead their own decision-making and manage their own lives in dealing with disaster resilience and recovery, but also ensuring that all people who are affected by disasters have safe, equitable and dignified access to humanitarian and psychosocial assistance. The way in which that plays out is that our focus is on, if you want to use old terminology, before, during and after. We do a lot of work in helping people build resilience or prepare themselves. We also work on response. We have volunteers in evacuation centres and the like, and we aim to support people in the long-term recovery after a disaster. Our approach is threefold. We deliver a range of direct services. We build capability across the sector, and we've been fortunate to have some really good people working in the team over the last 10 years or so, 15 years, and we've been able to share them around with local governments, smaller not-for-profits and the like, out in communities like Kinglake after these events happen. Because for a lot of communities, these things are a once-in-a-generation activity, fortunately. And suddenly people who were the community service manager or something else are thrust into running the recovery of a community that's been severely impacted. The third thing that we do, and I think is really significant in terms of today and in terms of research, is we advocate, we push for policy change, we try and bring the voice of the community to a range of different tables and a range of different discussions. At a practical level, some stats from a year or two ago, just as a bit of a summary of the sort of breadth of work that we get involved in. Our work in preparedness or resilience building in 2022-23 touched on 9 million people, made a connection in some way, shape or form. Just under 10,000 were involved in some of our resilience training workshops and activities. 45,000 assisted through direct response in places like evacuation centres and outreach visits, and about 22,000 were assisted through our longer term recovery work. We don't do any of that alone. We do it as part of a broad ecosystem, if I can use the term. We do it in partnership and collaboration, and we do that through the support of corporate supporters and donors, but we do it by engaging in the emergency management sector more broadly. I think we're the only organisation other than government that's on in emergency management arrangements at state, local and federal level. And we're a part of this thing called the International Federation of Red Cross. There's a Red Cross or Red Crescent Society in, I think, 192 countries at last count. So we are a part of that broader network of organisations. So there's the opportunity to learn from their experiences in different parts of the world and share our experiences with them in different parts of the world. Significantly, research is a big part of what the IFRC, as we term it, does. I talked about us having a focus on psychosocial, the psychological and the social wellbeing of people. There's actually a Red Cross reference centre in Copenhagen, of all places, where they focus specifically on psychosocial issues and how they relate to disasters. And I'm proud to say that one of the team who used to work with us is one of the key people in that centre now. She's moved over there, Shona Witten, and been there for the last few years. The other piece I would share, and this I think has grown enormously in the last 10 years in particular, is the research sector. And I've listed some names there, and you can have a look and see whether I've forgotten to include you. Inevitably, when you do these sorts of things, you forget someone, but just a few examples there of some of the organisations that we have partnered with or do continue to partner with. And it's many. And if we'd had this discussion 15 years ago, it would have been one or two. It's really grown and blossomed, and I think that's a fantastic thing, particularly in the way in which organisations like NHRA, and you heard from Cheryl this morning, the way in which they're bringing organisations like ourselves together with the research sector, both individually and collectively, to look at how research can best inform practice and how practice can inform research into the sorts of things that we need to look at and how we look at them. So let me jump from there to the research focus in particular. Going back to Black Saturday, that gives you a bit of a flavour of the scale of the thing. I think anyone who lived in Victoria would be well aware of that, but again, just to refocus your energy, or your attention, I should say. We really focused as an organisation on two key things. The first of those was managing a mammoth disaster appeal, which collected just under $380 million in donations, and working with the Victorian government to distribute those funds. That was a massive undertaking. The second thing was to set up a recovery program, and I think this is where research really starts to come to the fore. We had known for years that disasters such as the scale of this impact people. People take beyond 5 years, typically 5 to 7 years, to really start to get back on their feet. People will talk about getting back to where I was before the disaster. You never do that. You move to another place. But typically it takes 5 to 7 years is what some of the anecdotal feeling was at that stage. Based on that, we were able to, given the scale of Black Saturday, we were able to influence government to fund some of the recovery work that we and other organisations were undertaking for 5 years, 4 and 5 years. Traditionally, it had been if you could get 12 months of funding for a recovery program, that was a fantastic outcome. After Black Saturday, we had people in the field for 5 years. The other significant thing was we formed a partnership with the University of Melbourne, with a woman by the name of Liz Waters, who worked in their School of Public Health. Am I right in saying that, Lisa? Who's going to give me a nod? Close enough. Liz sadly is no longer with us, but she kicked the partnership off with ourselves, with some government input as well and a couple of other stakeholders, and that has blossomed into, under Lisa Gibbs's leadership, into a thing called Beyond Bushfires, and then more recently to an entity called Beyond Disasters. Now, what that partnership enabled was for us to share with the team at Uni Melbourne and other places some of our gut feeling, our insights into what we think happens in disasters in communities after a big disaster happens, but they were able to take it and run it and turn it into a longitudinal research study that went for about 10 years that gave us some really fantastic insights into impact on communities, impact on individuals, impact on families, impact on children, a range of different cohorts within the group that we worked with. So we were able to bring to the table connection to the community, connection to our volunteers, and connection to people who'd been through the disaster. And Uni of Melbourne were able to lead this collaborative effort to bring together the research to start to really strengthen the evidence base on which we do our work. The upshot of that was it's been incredibly influential in terms of policy and practice. One of the major outcomes was a thing called the Recovery Capitals Project, which highlights, as you can see on the little graph or the picture on the screen there, a number of key capitals or outcomes that people need to be on top of to lead successful lives and to recover effectively from different disasters. So I would highly recommend that to you. It's a few years old now, but I think a lot of the stuff in it is still very, very valid. Changing tack slightly, and I guess it depends on how you define research, but we were fortunate in about 2012 to be invited to be a part of a thing called the Australian Business Roundtable for Disaster Resilience. It's quite a mouthful. If you want to have a look at some of their work, just look up Business Roundtable for Resilience and you should find it within Google or elsewhere. And what it was 4 or 5 really big corporates, mostly Sydney-based. It was IAG, the insurance company, Westpac, Optus, Munich Reinsurance and Investor Property Group. They invited us to be a part of essentially a round table style group, not dissimilar to what's being talked about being formed today, albeit a bit smaller scale. And they had the CEOs sitting at the table who were concerned about the impacts of things like Black Saturday and the floods and cyclones that occurred in Brisbane a couple of summers after Black Saturday. So people like Gail Kelly, who was the then CEO of Westpac, were really moved by their experience visiting people out in the community after these events had taken place, and they felt like with a bit of commercial clout behind it, perhaps something could be done about it to make the lives of these people a little bit better, or ideally prevent these things from happening in the future. Presumably there was some commercial value in that as well, but I genuinely believe, having sat with those CEOs for, on and off for the next couple of years, that they were genuinely moved by what they'd seen and wanted to improve the lot of people out in the community. The upshot of it was that that group formed, and corporates being, who they are and what they're able to bring to the table, they were able to invest a substantial amount of money and get some research done. Different style of research to what I suspect most of you are involved in that it went to one of the big consultancy companies. Deloitte did the work on behalf of the round table, and what they did was to explore the imbalance, or highlight the imbalance, between the amount of money that is spent each and every year in Australia on responding to and recovering from disasters, as opposed to the amount that at that point in time was invested in resilience, mitigation and the like, and preventative activities. So the first of those reports really highlighted this issue, and it highlighted the massive discrepancy in the spend between the before and the after, to put it in simplest terms. Again, the value of having people like Gail Kelly at the front was they could get an audience with a bunch of politicians in Canberra, and the launch was done at Parliament House way back in 2014. I think the first one came out, 13 or 14. And they had the attention of the media, of the political agenda of the day and the like. Now, it's not the only thing that drove it, but from there, the federal government established a productivity commission review of expenditure on disasters and disaster prevention in particular. And ultimately we saw, after that review had been done and a range of other activities and advocacy had taken place, we saw the establishment of a thing called the Disaster Ready Fund a couple of years ago, which now sees a couple of $100 million per year put into dealing with or making communities more resilient and more prepared for disasters. So a really good example, I think, of the way in which research, small r, big R, however you consider the work of consultants versus academia, it really showed the impact you can have from a policy perspective as much as a practice point of view. The second of the reports, and the Roundtable put out about 5 reports in all, the second of those was something that was particularly significant from a Red Cross point of view, and something that we really pushed for. And that was the hidden impact, if you like, at least from a financial or economic point of view, the hidden impacts of disasters on the community numerically. We often hear about, this disaster's cost $2 billion in insurance terms, or the damage to infrastructure is X million, hundred millions of dollars. We never heard about the cost on health and wellbeing, on education and employment, and on community. So we set about, again, working with Deloitte, and a couple of us from Red Cross worked very closely with them, to look at what they loosely termed the intangible cost of a disaster. The long and the short of it, when they considered all those factors, and they looked at 3 case studies in particular, being Black Saturday, the floods in Queensland, and going back a little bit further, the earthquake that took place in Newcastle. What they found in each and every one of those was that the impact, when you translated using their economic modelling, when you translated it into dollar terms, the impact of those intangibles was just as much, if not a little bit more, than the numbers that were typically reported. So you could actually double the numbers on the impact of disasters that were happening in the country. That was quite telling from our point of view, and the bottom line for us was that it really highlighted the need for resilience and mitigation measures to look at social and psychological impacts as much as they look at the height of dam walls, at bridges and all those other important pieces of infrastructure. And that is a theme that we continue to push with government when they distribute the funds that they do from a resilience point of view, building resilience and the like. We often cite this sort of data in trying to push them to more and more invest in community level resilience in addition to the investment that they're putting into physical infrastructure. So the recommendations out of that were that pre and post disaster funding should better reflect those long-term social impacts, the importance of collaboration, and I'll touch on that a bit further in a second, further investment in community resilience programs and further research into the social impacts. And I would suggest to you that those issues, and particularly those last couple, are still as prevalent today as what they were some 10 years ago when that report first came out. I'm not suggesting there hasn't been progress. What I am suggesting is there could be more. The third partnership piece, loosely connected to research, is 5 or 6 years ago with the closure of EMA, Emergency Management Australia as it was then, their institute at Mount Macedon, the government determined to set up a thing called the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, effectively a virtual institute for resilience. We were pleased to be involved as a humanitarian partner with AFAC, who picked up the lead on the contract, but also with, significantly, I think, the Bushfire and Natural Hazard Cooperative Research Centre as it was then. Over time, that partnership has evolved, but I think those of you involved in the sector at all would agree that that concept of AIDA has really progressed the discussions and the thinking. And I think one of the keys in doing that is its connection into research. Having worked at Mount Macedon for a number of years, going way back before I joined Red Cross, as Alan alluded to, I was always very conscious that there were those of us who ran workshops and courses and things for people on disaster management, and there was a smaller group of research-connected people who dabbled in another corner, and the two never met. I think where we've come to in recent years, we're starting to see a really positive shift, or we have seen a really positive shift that continues to evolve, where research and practice are far more closely tied together, and that's got to be a good thing. The last thing I wanted to touch on, and then I'm happy to open up to questions and observations that you may have, and look forward to those. Some of the things that we as an organisation, and I think more broadly the emergency management sector, are thinking pretty much in depth about as we face the next sort of 5 or 10 years. There's a range of risks out there. Inevitably, climate change gets a lot of attention, and rightly so. But equally, there are other things that drive disasters and are of concern. And things like the geopolitical situation currently, cybersecurity issues and the stability of technology, and also the potential of another pandemic of some sort. You know, 7, 8 years ago, who in this audience would have thought that we were all going to be locked down for months at a time in a pandemic type situation? It's really quite hard to fathom what went on. The impacts are changing. We're seeing an increasing scale and a diversity of different types of events, as I mentioned. We've been involved in supporting communities after what happened in Burke Street. A little while ago, maybe 18 months, 2 years ago, there was a really sad situation in a Tasmanian community where a jumping castle took off on strong winds, hadn't been tied down appropriately or whatever happened, I'm not too sure, and kids were killed. We've done a lot of work in that community post that event. So the stuff that gets all the attention, the fires, the floods, etc., not the only cause of the work that a lot of us get involved with. We're also seeing cascading and concurrent disasters. A lot of things are happening at the same time now, and for some communities, they're hit with a bushfire one year, a flood the next, particularly prevalent in places in New South Wales at present. And that is a challenge that continues to grow, unfortunately. The other thing that I think really needs thinking about and navigating for those of us in organisations involved is the system in which we work. Key things like individual and community capacity and motivation need to be a part of everyone's agenda. There are multiple jurisdictions and organisations involved. As I said at the outset, an earlier discussion like this would have seen a handful of people in the room 15, 20 years ago. Equally, the number of organisations providing services to or on behalf of communities 15 or 20 years ago was relatively small. Now it's a really big space. And for the most part, that's a positive thing. But it has also engendered a sense of competitiveness, I think, which we need to get our heads around and think about how we overcome and make sure that what we're all doing is connected and for the good of the communities with which we work or on whose behalf we work. Growth, coordination and collaboration are really critical as far as we're concerned. And just lastly, a few questions that I would leave with you to think about. And the first couple of these actually really came about, or I've used in other presentations where I'm talking to emergency management agencies more than research agencies, but I think there's still some validity. In a rapidly evolving world, how do we ensure that the model or the system we use to deal with disasters remains fit for purpose? And I think you can ask the same question about how does research plug into that, and is it being as effective as possible? How can we ensure that community outcomes remain at the centre of everything that we do? None of us are in a job if it's not about the community who are at the other end of whatever it is we're trying to deal with, whether it's researching it, providing a service or what have you. In a rapidly expanding environment, how do we promote collaboration rather than competition? Or as someone said to me over lunch today, how do we get the positive of a little bit of competition without the negative of, cutthroat, everyone fighting for the last dollar type thing? How do we work better or continue to improve the ways in which we work collaboratively? And the last one, of most significance to you all, what's the role of research and research institutions in all of this? From a Red Cross perspective, a couple of bits of work that we are involved with in terms of research and collaboration, or things that we're planning and working on at present. The first is a piece of work we're doing with Deakin Uni, looking at the social capital return on investment. So when we go into looking to promote community resilience and investment in communities for their resilience programs, we found that we needed some numbers and some data to be able to put in front of funders and say, if you invest this much in a community, the savings or the reduction of impact of disaster is going to be this much. It's easy to say when you raise the height of a dam wall that that's going to mean that further out is not going to flood, and that's, I'm sure, I'm no engineer as you can hear, but that I'm sure is a lot more easy to prove than some of the social stuff, and we're trying to put some numbers against that. That's a piece of research that should be out in the next month or so, and I'll be happy to share it with you all when the time comes. The second is to look at the humanitarian impacts of climate change, and that's something we're just exploring with ANU and CSIRO and a couple of others. It's still very much on the drawing board, but a piece of work that we want to really start to look at what are the very real human impacts and what can be done about them. Not new in some regards, but we will endeavour to have it very focused on the humanitarian side of things as it relates to climate change. So they're just a couple of bits that we are working on. I know there are multitude organisations in the room doing significantly more work in terms of research, but I thought I would just share those with you. So just in closing, again, thank you for your time. Happy to take any questions that people may have, or commentary for that matter. Either one is very much welcomed. And again, just a reminder at the end there, a couple of pictures there, an image of Peter again, and hopefully 15 years on, he's doing well. And the little picture at the front there, the girl holding the teddy, that's interestingly one of our more, one of our biggest successes, I guess, in our emergencies work is the simple act of giving out these things called trauma teddies. They're knitted by volunteers across the country, and we provide them to, obviously, kids in settings such as Black Saturday. And, for a while we thought, is this really useful or not? The feedback we get is incredible, and at last count, I think we'd given out something like 45,000 of them over the years. So sometimes it's the little things that make a difference, and I'm sure if there are child wellbeing researchers out there, they would have lots of stories to tell about why things like that are significant to people in a post-disaster setting. But enough from me. It would be lovely to hear from some of you. Any questions or comments or thoughts?